On tonight's show, how is the coronavirus impacting people's mental health? We ask this question to the Director of Counseling and Psychological Services at Eastern, Dr. Bryce Crapser. And the ETV Sports Crew is here to break down the top 3 moments over the last 4 years in Eastern athletics. All of this tonight on the April 23rd edition of ETV News.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Tyler Madden.
And I'm Julia Florence. Thank you so much for joining us.
With everyone's schedules changing and lives being so drastically different than just a few months ago, how has all of this been impacting people's mental health? To get an answer to that question and more, I recently sat down with Dr. Bryce Crapser, the Director of Counseling and Psychological Services at Eastern. Take a look. Doctor, thank you for joining me.
Hello, great to be here. Thanks for having me, Tyler.
So what's the impact then that an event like this can have on someone's mental health?
Sure. Yeah, so I think that can be a pretty broad kind of answer. I think that the impact can be of people being quarantined or doing social distancing or distance learning. It can be pretty varied, but it's also in an interesting way kind of also shared. People understand a lot of what this is like because we're all going through it. So I think it's both, there's a lot of variation and there's a lot of similarities at the same time. But specifically for what we're seeing, so I work, I'm the director of the counseling center at Eastern, and what we see with our clients, a lot of times can be an exacerbation or worsening of some of the symptoms that we're seeing. So anxiety is getting worse. Depression symptoms are kind of coming back online because being separate from a lot of your support system makes it really difficult. There's that isolation factor that kind of comes into play. I'm seeing, an uptick of trauma symptoms as well. People are kind of struggling a little bit more to manage some pre-existing kinds of mental health conditions that they've been struggling with. So a lot of folks are really having a difficult time. And I think at the same time, we're seeing people really rise to the occasion. We're seeing some resilience, people being creative, students being very, kind of optimistic and reaching out in very creative ways, being able to kind of be compassionate towards other people and help other people out. And I think that's been one of the really beneficial aspects to this whole situation, because I feel like in a lot of ways, this whole time has been pretty funky, and I'm kind of running out of synonyms for unprecedented and uncharted because it's so undefined. We're not really sure what the impacts of this situation will be on people's mental health, especially long term, probably until afterward. But for right now, we're seeing a lot of varied reactions on folks' mental health. The other piece that's kind of important to consider is that we're all going through a pretty good set of losses right now. A loss of safety, of security, of certainty. For some people that had to go away from campus, it's this loss of the supportive campus and their friends and professors and some sense of normalcy. And for a lot of people, that's, they were a lot more safe when they were at school. So there's a loss of those, very important aspects of their lives. So a lot of times people are talking about this weird general sense of just, not feeling motivated, kind of feeling out of it, feeling disoriented. And a lot of times that can be related to grief, like a grieving for all of these losses. So that's some of the things that folks are kind of struggling with and the impacts that it can have on people's mental health.
In talking about kind of that loss, that means sometimes that coping mechanism is gone. You aren't able to be around your friends. You aren't able to go to the gym and do those normal things. So what's that? What do you suggest for people that are struggling with that?
Yeah, and I think that there's a lot of struggle with that. Kind of the rug got pulled out from under a lot of folks, and they're not really sure what to do and how to continue those normal coping mechanisms that were really effective. So what I'd encourage folks to do is to kind of get your next best approximation to what was working before. If exercise is what helped you, find a way to work out at home. There's a lot of free resources now, online that, have daily workouts or daily yoga. Find a way to practice, some of those coping mechanisms that were working for you. Find what works and apply it to this new and weird situation, which can be kind of tricky, and sometimes you have to get a little creative, but I'm finding that there's a lot of information out there about, how to cope with this time because we're all trying to figure it out. And I think there are a lot of right answers, but it's about whatever the right answer for you would be. So when coping mechanisms are taken away, we have to focus on the things that we actually can control in our lives and try to identify some coping mechanisms that do work. I think, for instance, things like these stress books, the coloring workbooks and everything like that, finding something like a puzzle to do or something that takes you a long period of time to, like a project, something like that can be a really good coping mechanism. So I think that there's a lot of right answers to this, but I think that sometimes we get stuck in that lost, like, I don't even know where to start. This is so weird and funky. We're kind of, I think, through a little bit of that initial shock phase of after this change happened. But now as the dust is settling, I think that it's important that we kind of, we try to develop a new sense of what normalcy is. And I think that means a lot of different things for different people, especially when it comes to coping, because, coping's personal. But find whatever worked for you in the past and see what happens when you apply it to this new kind of situation as best you can.
So kind of switching gears a little bit with everybody being at home, there's been this massive influx of information daily on the coronavirus. And so there's that balance that I'm hearing from people of being overwhelmed with the amount of news they're hearing versus trying to stay informed. So for people that are struggling with that, what's the advice you give to them? How are you handling it, all this information coming in?
Sure. Yeah, no, I think that's a really good question because I think, if we let it, we can get inundated, 24/7 news cycle. And I think that, because everything's so available with social media and with the internet and, we could, if you let it, you could just be doing that all day. So I think some of the advice that I would give would be to really just like chunk the time, kind of designate 30-minute blocks of time for certain activities, So if you say like, at 8 in the morning and then 6 at night, you're doing 30 minutes of, checking online and going through your news feed and kind of staying updated and informed, dedicate it to that because you don't want to necessarily disconnect fully. Although sometimes taking, a detox break from social media and the internet, I think can be a really good idea. You don't necessarily want to do that all the time. You also don't want to kind of be just enveloped in it either. So you're right. It is kind of a balance, and I think that putting some limits around the time that you're using, that you're using news outlets and kind of digesting some of that, I think is a really good idea. Sometimes I've known people to kind of not to get rid of their certain apps that they spend a lot of time on. They just kind of delete it and say, they let everybody know, like, look, I'm taking a week break or a day break or whatever it is. And they physically just kind of delete that app, and that's what kind of has them separate a little bit. Because you're right, you do want to balance it, and you do want to pace yourself. I think moderation and is really important, especially now. And there's a lot of different ways that you can do that. But setting some reasonable limits on your usage, I think, is probably my best advice.
So before we started talking, you're saying you're still working from home now. You haven't been back to campus since everybody moved out spring break. What are the new ways that you're connecting and talking with people because meeting on campus isn't an option?
Sure. Yeah. So that's been kind of the majority of our focus for the counseling center has been transitioning our counseling services, from in-person counseling to telehealth. So at this point, we've had our entire staff trained on telehealth counseling, and we have started using platforms like DoxyMe and WebEx to do video conferencing and video counseling services. So we connected with all of our current clients in early March, or that were active in early March, and we tried to set as many of them up as we could with telehealth services, and we've been doing kind of as close to business as usual as we could because we know that the demand for mental health support right now is definitely there. And we want to make sure that we are able to provide some service to Eastern students.
Yeah, kind of talking about where that mentality of we're all in this together. We're all really going through these same things. What's your overall message to everybody, Eastern students, about really going through this trying time, as you mentioned before, that nobody's ever been through before?
Right. Yeah. I wish there was some nice, cleanly packaged kind of message I could deliver that would, ring true for everybody, and that would, ease a lot of anxieties and kind of offer assurances and all of that. And I think the reality is that we don't know what's going to be happening. There's a lot of unknowns, and this is kind of, there's no roadmap for this. And so we're all kind of doing the best we can, doing the best thing that we know to do next. Kind of a one thing at a time kind of pace. But we are all in this together, and I think that this is a time when we need to be especially compassionate and understanding, and flexible with one another, and kind to one another, and also kind and considerate and compassionate to ourselves. I think that that's where that can really start, is like, coming at this and understanding that, this is pretty uncharted, and we don't really know what it's going to mean. And that means you need to really, give yourself some slack, give yourself some slack, and also be understanding and considerate with others. Because I think that, we are all going to get through this. We're going to get through this. Things will not be, as difficult as they are right now. But at the same time, and we don't need to let this swallow us up. So I think that there's a lot of things that we can do to kind of weather and to get through. There's a lot of opportunity in this experience. I think there's, time to be creative and to do new things that you haven't been able to do before in the past, new skills, and a lot of, new projects that have been waiting, and now you have no excuse to kind of not do them, and things like that. So I think that, there's a lot of opportunity in this. And I think that I'm hopeful that everybody is continuing to be supportive of one another, and to, just be there for one another as best as we can while we're being socially distant. Yeah.
Well, Dr. Crapser, we appreciate you taking the time, and thank you again for joining me today.
You bet. I appreciate it. And thank you, Tyler. Hope that you stay safe and healthy, and that you take care of yourself.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
There's been a noticeable change to an iconic landmark in downtown Willimantic. Take a look at this. The historic frogs on the Frog Bridge have also followed along with the recommendations of health officials to wear masks when out in public. This notable change isn't the only time that the frogs have an added piece of clothing, as they wear scarves during the winter to keep warm.
Julia, we're not the only ones that have been utilizing new technology during this different time. As reporter Adam Amin interviewed a number of beloved college mascots during a Zoom video call. The call included more than a dozen mascots, including UConn's Jonathan the Husky and Butler University's Butler Blue.
Tyler, from buzzer beaters to walk-offs to penalty kicks, there have been a number of iconic moments in Eastern athletics. And over the past few weeks, the ETV Sports Crew has been compiling their top 15 list to honor the best of the best.
That's right, Julie. And recently I caught up with Ryan Gable and Jared Soltis of ETV Sports to break down the top 3 moments over the last 4 years. Guys, thanks for coming on. But before we break down the top 3 moments, Ryan, what was the inspiration behind putting this list together?
Well, Tyler, given the certain circumstances that we are in right now, no live games are going on. So we still wanted to provide content for the fans and the whole entire Eastern athletic community. So we decided, make this list. And we knew that Eastern Connecticut has had an historic 4 years, with winning their Commissioner's Cups multiple years. And a lot of exciting games. We just wanted to, tell those stories to everyone, the fans, the parents, the community, and just everyone to know that, hey, this has really been a special 4 years here at Eastern Connecticut. There's been many exciting games, many exciting finishes, many championships, and, we wanted to tell that story to everyone.
Jared, 4 years of moments and plays to go through. How difficult was it to choose the top 15 and then pick the top 3?
I mean, it was very difficult, Tyler. Of course, last 3 years, Eastern's really been the most dominant athletic program in the Little East Conference. So, I mean, you got to sift through a number of games, and there's been tons of moments. And, of course, I'm only a sophomore, so I've only been able to see 2 years of all these epic moments. And Jack Petrucci, he was kind of our go-to man when it would go back a couple years farther back. He was giving us some insight on maybe some games that we should pick, and then we were able to go back and run back through those highlights, and then we were able to decipher between the two. But like you said, a lot of good moments that have happened over the last few years. Very difficult to decide, but we were able to get it down to 15, and hopefully the fans are happy with the list that we put together and don't think that we left any out.
So let's get to it. The top 3 moments over the last 4 years. Jarrett, take us through number 3.
So for number 3 on our list, Tyler, we're going to go back to 2017, actually, in Little East Conference men's basketball final between two of the biggest rivals in the Little East Conference, Keene and Eastern Connecticut, played on Eastern's home court right in the Geisler Gymnasium. And another exciting game between these two teams. I mean, a really good Keene team. That team that year actually made it all the way to the Elite Eight. So they didn't make it, made an at-large bid into the NCAA tournament, but came into that game. And it was looking a little grim for Eastern in the early stages of that game. Keene goes up 13 points early on. Then some injuries. Tarshi Brown goes down. Hugh Lindo goes down. Dave Piani goes down. So it was looking pretty grim for Eastern Connecticut, but then it was Carlos Gonzalez, the freshman at the time. He stepped up big. He would end up finishing with 30 points for Eastern Connecticut in that game. And what a magnificent game that was in the late stages. Eastern's down 13 in the second half. And then with just under 10 minutes to go, Gonzalez, a big steal, comes down, cuts the lead down to 1. And then Hugh Lindo, he ends up actually returning after that gruesome shoulder injury that he suffered earlier in the game. And then he just came up big in the last few stages of the game. Big putback layup with a few minutes left. A big block on Ty Nichols that actually led to a Carlos Gonzalez layup the other way with just under a minute to play. So some big plays down the stretch in that game. And then, of course, the play that everyone remembers is Carlos Gonzalez, the backdoor layup that he hit to really seal that game. And then Keene comes down. They try to get that last-second ditch effort by Ty Nichols, but it ends up coming up just short. And the Warriors, they win their 4th Little East Conference tournament in their program history.
Going from number 3 to number 2, Ryan, going from men's basketball to women's basketball, a little bit of a different environment. Men's team at home at number 3, women's basketball team on the road at number 2. Take me through that game.
Yeah, number 2 is going to be on February 23rd, 2019, the Little East Conference Championship game for the women's team against the UMass Dark Corsairs. And I had the high honor of covering that game. It was overall just an exciting one. It was a big storyline going into it was that, the Warriors lost to the Corsairs in both matchups in the regular season. So maybe that they could change things up in the third matchup. But, the atmosphere was electric. It was a great game. First 3 quarters was pretty competitive. And the Corsairs had the slight edge. They had a 10-point lead at one point in the third, but what really changed things up, going into the fourth quarter was Akira Exmon, the Corsairs' all-time leading scorer, rebounder, and an All-American. She picked up her 5th foul. She fouled out, and she was done for the rest of the game. So that kind of shifted the momentum in the Warriors' favor. But the Warriors started to come back a little bit, and then what kind of hurt them was Julie Keckler fouled out, and Julie Jordan had to step in for the Warriors, and she stepped up great. The Warriors did just enough to force overtime. Julie Jordan had some great baskets in overtime. Mai Villard had some great free throws in overtime, and really sealed the deal was, that famous play that we all know. Yeah, bounce play from Jenna Sarantino to Anna Berry. Beautiful pass by Sarantino. Anna Berry gets the basket. She gets down 1, converts the 3-point play, and that really got the Warriors that 5-point win. And Mai Villard, she was termed MVP. She finished with 27 points, 17 rebounds, and Berry had a double-double. Kelsey Santagata had a great game as well. And, Coach Beerley picked up her 4th tournament championship, and it was just a great game and well-deserving number 2. It was unbelievable. It was a memorable one, and surely that'll be one in the record books.
Ryan, it seems like Coach Beerley and the women's team really hasn't looked back since that game, repeating back-to-back as champions this year. And now moving on to number 1, on to the softball team, Jared, a team that has had its fair share of success over the last number of years.
Yeah, Eastern's really most historic program. The run they went on last year was truly special, and it was tough to come up with number 1, but we ended up giving it to the softball team after a magnificent season that they had. And the whole storyline, we ended up picking the Super Regional game number 2 as the moment, but the whole storyline starts a few days earlier at the regional. Of course, Eastern's able to win that, and then they're going to move on to the Super Regional with a chance to go to the national championship. But the other game, the winner of the MIT Rowan game, is the 2 teams that Eastern could be playing. And Eastern coaches, players, and fans are starting to realize when that game is going on that Rowan never put in a bid to host. So if Rowan is to win that game, that means Eastern is going to host the Super Regional. And of course, like we always would expect, it's going to end in a dramatic fashion. That Rowan-MIT game goes 14 innings, and Eastern players, they're all getting together to watch the end of that game, dramatic ending that ended up being. Of course, Rowan wins, and then that means Eastern, they're going to host a Super Regional. And in hosting a Super Regional, I mean, one of the most historic games that Eastern's ever hosted on home turf. So, I mean, that game, game number 2, game number 1, Eastern takes that in dramatic fashion. It was a pitcher's duel between Jesse DiDomenico and Morgan Bolduc. And then you look at game number 2, and more dramatics happen. I mean, there were some controversial calls during that game. Of course, that 5th inning, you see that runner's interference call at first base. Runners called out, and that kind of changed the tide for Rowan. And Eastern, they strike early, 1-0. And then there's no scoring that goes on until the top of the 6th inning when Morgan Zane, she goes big fly and gives Rowan a 2-1 lead. But, of course, Eastern, they come back. I mean, they get the bases loaded in that bottom half of the 6th inning. Lauren Shannon, she runs into some trouble. So head coach Kim Wilson, she goes back to DiDomenico, who had thrown a number of pitches in game number 1, and she's expected to come back and do the same thing to close out game number 2. But then it's Morgan Bolduc, the play that everyone remembers, getting that base hit, scores 2 runs, and that's kind of what sealed the deal. And then to capper, of all things, in the top half of the 7th, the fly up to center field, Sabrina Lemire catches it, and Eastern going on to the national championship with a chance to go back and win their 6th national championship in the program's storied history. And just several underlying storylines. Of course, we talk about the MIT Rowan game, how big that was in determining it, and then the in-game dramatics of game number 2 in that Super Regional that was just so uplifting for the spirits of Eastern Connecticut going in to that national championship as they would head to Tyler, Texas.
And I had the opportunity to be at both of those games, and I know, Ryan, you were there too. Just talk about how that softball team really unified the entire Eastern community on this run, kind of this underdog run heading to Tyler, Texas.
Yeah, Clyde Washburn Field certainly was something that I will never forget for the rest of my life. It was certainly electric. As you mentioned, the entire Eastern athletic community got together, and it was just amazing. The Warriors, had the underdog mentality, and they kept on fighting through, and the fans, they were in it the whole entire time.
Well, guys, there for sure been a lot of pretty cool historic moments that have happened over the last 4 years, and great job with putting this list together. Thanks again, Ryan. Gable and Jared Soltis is here to break down the top 3 plays over the last 4 years. Well, that's it for this week's edition of ETV News.
For everyone watching, thank you for making us a part of your day. And we hope you're able to tune in again next time.
As we'll be back with more interviews from members of the Eastern community.
In the meantime, stay well, and we'll see you next week, Eastern.